Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 2026 Emory legislation debrief. My name is Sebastian Asady. Most of you already know me, but if you don't, I'm the debate director for Equality and Forensics, and I'm here to you today just to go over all the bills on the docket. So we're just going to jump right in. We're not going to waste any time. There's 15 bills for us to go through. This hopefully won't take that long. Um, but yes, there are people here live. Usually people pop in and out, and we'll be answering their questions as they come in and go. All right. So the first bill that we're going to be talking about is a bill to restrict pharmaceutical advertising to protect public health. This one, I believe, has appeared at different tournaments in the past. We've had this at a similar bill at nationals, I want to say. Um, Really, all this is targeting is trying to reduce manipulation that can come across when certain pharmaceutical companies target their advertisements. Because, I mean, if you've been watching like cable TV, you'll probably have noticed that all the advertisements kind of follow the same formula. They've got, all sorts of happy actors talking about how their life has changed after using a medication. And even though they list all the side effects, they try to paint the drug as like this miracle medication that no matter the price tag is really, really worth it. Um, Unfortunately, some people actually do fall for that. Not that they fall for that, but they do really believe that. And so they'll start like dumping a lot of money into trying to fix their ailments using medication that they see on TV, even though that might not work for them. So really all this bill is trying to do is just reduce the deception that may happen or may, come across to viewers by restricting when advertisements can run as seen in Section 1A, by restricting where they can run in Section 1B, and by restricting how they can run, as in like what can they include in their content. Um, this is pretty straightforward, in my opinion, but the debate itself may be a little bit hard to predict. The reason I say that is because it's not really clear to me what direction this debate is going to take. It's very likely that the AF may win pretty easily just by proving that these pharmaceutical companies do actually profit pretty heavily off of using manipulative imagery, testimonials, et cetera, et cetera. And that in a lot of cases, the consumer actually doesn't benefit, right? So that's the burden of the app. You got to prove that with pharmaceutical advertising, corporations benefit, consumers do not, right? And the neg has also a pretty simple case to argue. Um, that being that these advertisements increase awareness, can help, all sorts of people discover ailments or illnesses that they may not know that they had. Um, it could increase awareness in terms of sort of drugs. So, like if someone is using one drug and then they see an advertisement for a competing drug because their current drug is not working for them, they may be able to switch to the competitor, and that can provide better care for them. So, it really all just boils down to weighing in this debate. There is no clear way to just win the debate through logic. The AF again needs to prove that pharmaceutical companies benefit, and the neg needs to prove that this actually helps consumers, that advertisements do. Personally, I think that I could agree with either side. I mean, I think that either side could definitely win this debate. It really just comes down to how you use your evidence, and what people actually say. Like, if certain people that you pull your evidence from or certain sources claim that, like, these advertisements actually do help people because studies have shown that when people watch TV and pick up drugs that they find online, um, they see like more positive health benefits. I'm more inclined to agree with that. It really just comes down to the research and the weighing. But like I said, no clear winner off the bat. So I think this would be definitely an interesting debate. All right, second bill, very relevant with the climate of like how the world is moving today. This one is also pretty straightforward, just a bill to regulate the water usage of AI systems. So if you don't already know, AI systems like on the back end are super, super water and energy intensive. Um, in order to actually cool down the server rooms and everything that like AI processing actually uses, you need to use coolant, and like the most viable, most widespread coolant is just straight water. And they can't use salt water because salt water can corrode parts, so it must be fresh water. The other problem is that fresh water is what we drink, right? So in a lot of cases, many experts are worried that the more we continue to use ChatGPT and Gemini and everything else, we're going to continue to drain our water resources to a point that certain places may see droughts or lack of access to water or things like that, which is obviously not good. I personally think that the aft is a lot stronger here. Um, the only reason I say that is because the burden of the neg is to argue that somehow AI systems without water regulation is better than with water regulation. Um, which I personally think that if the AF impacts this well by impacting it out to droughts, to livelihoods, to all sorts of different things, they win this pretty easily. And I can't just buy the neg argument like surface level. Key things to definitely research here. Where are these AI data centers or AI systems being implemented? Um, a lot of AI data centers are located in the heart of the country, and they're pulling from water reservoirs that are like underground, right? Like I forgot the technical word for it is, but those yeah, I forgot what the word is. But basically underground there's a bunch of freshwater supply, and they're pulling from those, and that can threaten farmland, right? Because the farmland needs the water. It can threaten water supplies for people, all sorts of different things. And it's very hard to recycle the AI, coolant water. So the way I think about the strongest AF point here is to definitely just impact it out to lives, obviously, by saying that like whenever some student asks like ChatGPT to complete their homework for them, that's taking up a significant amount of water that, could have been diverted towards crops, towards water production, towards like waste systems. And there's so many impacts you can go from there. I just think that the location is also important because some locations are more, you know, have more access to water than other locations. And, maybe these AI data centers are being located on like farmland, but also like on Native American reservations because they have less restrictions or all sorts of different things. So I would definitely impact it to like the local people surrounding these AI systems because that's like how you drive this home. Um, and plus, I mean, the app can also just straight up argue that like I don't think it's impossible to prove that the industry is already moving in this direction because even like OpenAI and Google and every other company knows that these AI systems are so water intensive, which means higher running costs for the company, but also means that like water is an expendable resource, and there's a good chance that in quite a few years, those AI data centers won't have enough water to keep up with their tasks, especially because AI is also growing. So I think you can frame a speech on the app that's just like, well, companies are already trying to limit their water usage. This just kind of formalizes it and gives them a bigger nudge and more guidance to like innovate further. In terms of the neg, I think you could maybe argue like less water means that AI systems are going to be slower, that they're going to be um, less advanced. Innovation can slow down, but like I said earlier, if this really boils down to weighing in like the late round, the AF can just win by arguing that lives are destroyed by this, believe it or not. And that kind of outweighs any innovation, right? Like, does innovation really matter if there's no one there to actually experience the innovation? Probably not so much. Um, maybe there's a really, really unique neg that you can argue here. It's just not coming to me now. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to talk about them. If not, we can just keep going. Okay. I guess we don't have any questions. We'll just keep going. And okay, a bill to sanction Qatar. This one is more interesting because of its relevance. It's even more relevant than the AI debate, in my opinion. Um, if you haven't been following the news closely, recently there's been a lot of turmoil in the Middle East because um, following Trump's decisive action in Venezuela by kidnapping Maduro, he's been kind of on this, I guess, 2026 New Year's resolution of doing whatever the hell he wants and not caring. Which is, I mean, great for him. If he wants to do that, he can, I guess. But that's the big issue in Washington right now. So all lawmakers are basically arguing what are the president's law powers or war powers? What can the president do and not do, right? Was the kidnapping of Maduro actually justified? And there's a lot of conflicting opinions on that. that has kind of culminated into Trump's current foreign policy on Iran, which is what I want to talk about specifically with this debate. Um, as a result of the US armed forces' success in Venezuela, Trump has adopted this policy of whenever he's saying something, he actually means it. And that applies to Iran as well. Iran right now is in a significant state of absolute crisis because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of protesters on the streets around the country that are protesting two things: one, against the government, and two, the hyperinflation that the economy is experiencing. Um, if you actually pull up a Google currency conversion between the Iranian rial and the US dollar, on I want to say like January 5th or 6th, it was about $1 equals 42,000 rial, which is pretty high, but not crazy. And then the next day it jumped to about 993,000 rial. And then the next day it went to about like 1.4 million rial. So in a matter of like 48 hours, the currency has been devalued to a point that it's essentially worthless, right? Which, I mean, basic economics dictates that's never something you want to have. So Iran has been accused of killing upwards of 2,000 protesters. Um, some sources put that up at 12,000, which is absolutely mind-boggling. And as a result, Trump has basically said no more. And continuously threatened the Iranian regime with decisive action over and over and over again. Recently, as this pertains to Qatar, yesterday, Trump and the State Department ordered, and the Department of Defense ordered several officials to evacuate from the United States' largest military base, which is in Qatar. And they're doing so similarly to how they struck Iran over the summer. So, if you recall, US forces struck Iran's nuclear program in many different places. This was, I believe, like during the 12-day conflict between Iran and Israel in June. And prior to those strikes, we did the exact same thing that we're doing now, right? Which means, like, back then we were evacuating our personnel from the region right before we committed to the strikes. And right now, as of this recording, we are evacuating people from the region. So a lot of people are starting to think we're going to strike. And that means that Qatar is super important in all of this, right? Because we're basically basing all of our operations from our station in Qatar. Um, that's why I personally would wait to write the speech and to see how things play out in the situation, because overarching idea is here is because of the tensions in the Middle East, we should not be angering Qatar. We really, really do need their support now more than ever because of their critical importance to our strategic capabilities in the Middle East, as per the war in Iran, monitoring the situation in Israel as well, and with whatever conflicts that may arise. So I will say the app still has a strong case here. You can definitely run a speech that's like, Qatar has created a lot of human rights violations, and we can't wait any longer, right? I think that you can definitely get away with saying, like, for example, during the World Cup when Qatar was hosting, they brought in thousands and thousands of migrant workers that were improperly treated to construct their facilities. And that created headlines around the world. There is a lot of discrimination that goes on in Qatar, and it doesn't align with Western values. It doesn't align with what we stand for, and they need to change. That's what the app argues. And that's saying they need to prove that sanctions will actually twist their arm into doing this. The neg also has a super strong case because all they have to say is you sanction Qatar, you alienate them, our strategic capabilities are now in complete jeopardy, and that throws the Iran situation into significantly more turmoil. Um, which I also don't think is impossible to buy or to argue. I do think that it's pretty easy to prove both sides, but it just comes down to a weighing scenario of like time frame, of importance, and of genuine effect on like someone's life, or the people of Qatar's lives, right? In terms of time frame, the AF has to argue that this needs to be done now because this is such a current issue and Qatar is still abusing people as we speak, and that's leading to like mass starvation or all sorts of like different, loss of benefits for all these workers. And the NEG has to argue that this is bad on the time frame because of what's going on in the Middle East. Like this is the worst time to implement a policy like this because we need to stand with Qatar against Iran. Um, in terms of genuine like personal impact, I think that the AF and NEG could win this easily. Like, I mean, it really is a toss up here because the AF can definitely argue that we need to pass this now because for the workers in Qatar, their discrimination happens day after day after day, and it's really, really like dehumanizing. It's causing a lot of death. It's really unfair and unjust, and it's rooted in ideology that really is not, you know, modern in the sense. Um, and you can definitely win that time frame debate by saying, if we don't pass this bill, more people will continue to be abused, discriminated against, etc., which just perpetuates like their pain and suffering. On the flip side, the neg the neg is entirely dependent on how the situation in Iran unfolds, and if we do eventually strike in the time between this recording and Emory. But the neg can definitely argue this legislation is so bad because for the people in Iran that are dependent on us, right? Like they're waiting for our decisive action to take place. And when we do, they see it as like a force of liberation and whatnot. And for the people of Iran, which is like in the millions, we need Qatar to potentially oust like this regime that has killed potentially 12,000 people in a span of 2 days, right? That's a really, really human impact because you've got this dictatorship that might not be on the verge of collapse, but is really, really facing a strong crisis. And you have the chance to like correct their ills, and you're not able to take it because of passing this legislation, right? So basically, what matters more, the stability of Iran and its people, or the consistent dehumanizing abuse of workers in Qatar? That's what the weighing comes down to. You can argue both ways, but I personally would just wait until the situation in the Middle East develops further so that you have more understanding and you want to be like surprised with new developments right before Emory happens that requires you to change your entire speech. With that, do you guys have any questions? Okay, we'll jump to the next bill. All right, so we're coming back down from a very, very, complex and intricate bill. This is a very straightforward debate. Assault weapons ban, right? This has been done so many times in Congress, but I mean, the AF here and the neg here, I'd say the AF is super obvious and the neg is very obscure. Um, the AF is, of course, America is one of the, most like guns per capita countries in the world. Like we genuinely have so many weapons in this country. And in that creates a lot of violence. We have we have an attachment to our weapons because of the Second Amendment, right? And while a lot of people argue that it is our constitutional right, to prevent like to create an uprising against the government in case it becomes tyrannical, which is the purpose of the Second Amendment, um, it does create a lot of leniency for people to purchase firearms, and a sizable portion of the time, those firearms are not used for good. Now, it's important to understand that because of how many weapons we have in the country, I'm not saying that most of those weapons are used for violent purposes. In fact, I would argue the opposite. I think it's completely justifiable and, if not factually correct, to say that over like 95% of the weapons in the United States are used for self-defense purposes, are used for, you know, non-violence against people. But there is a 5%. And that 5% creates so much trauma, so much devastation for families. We've seen countless school shootings in this country. I mean, heck, like at the school that I attend, we are required to have clear backpacks because of our proximity to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, which was the site of a horrific mass shooting just a couple years ago. Um, and in Florida as well, there was a shooting at Florida State University not too long ago. It's all too common now that schools and public spaces have become this like the sites of massacres. And the AF can argue in the context of this bill, like having these weapons so widespread is the root cause of that. We don't have the resources to properly maintain like background checks. We don't have the resources to track all the weapons. When is the death toll enough to finally put a stop to this with this legislation, right? The neg, of course, argues constitutionality, right? Because under the Second Amendment, all Americans are allowed to have the right to bear arms. And the neg can argue that instead of putting a blanket ban on all of these weapons, on basically almost all guns, then like instead of passing that blanket ban, we should instead implement better background checks because like the vast majority of weapons in America are not used for violence against other innocent people, right? What's important to note is that in Section 2A of this legislation, assault weapon is defined as almost any gun, which probably includes for hunting purposes. Would I say it's strong to go on the neg and argue that, oh, we need weapons to, shoot animals for hunting? No, absolutely not. But you are banning with this legislation all automatic rifles, which, I mean, are technically already banned. You cannot use full auto unless you're law enforcement. Um, all semi-automatic rifles, which are the only rifles you can actually like get your hands on right now. Um, all pistols, which are the most common form of weapon in the United States, or shotguns, which are primarily used for hunting or self-defense at home purposes. Um, I will say this, as much as you may have heard, and this is some important contextualization, as much as you may have heard that a lot of mass shootings occur using stuff that's like such as the AR-15 platform, which is a semi-automatic rifle platform. A very, very, very large portion of mass shootings also occur with pistols, which are unreasonably easy to get. Um, and so the AF here can argue a very, very simple and strong case that I think anyone should go with. That being, even though this puts our like this bill has some constitutionality problems, it is necessary to curb the violence that we're seeing right now. Because, like I said, there has been so much devastation and families have been put through so much trauma because of them losing their loved ones to an incident that they had zero control over, right? It's not uncommon for people to lose someone because they got shot in an argument or because of road rage or because of all sorts of different things, right? The fact is, all the shootings that you hear on the news are really just the really, really big ones. But if you pull up your local news station, I guarantee you that, like, as far as where I live, almost every day there is another shooting reported. There is always like one or two victims. Some of them are very, very lucky and don't have life-threatening injuries, but a lot of them do lose their lives because they just want to go out in public. They want to go about their business. They get into an argument, they get shot, they get killed, or anything of the sort, right? I think that's a key distinction for the AF to also make. The biggest mass shootings are the ones that take the headline, but the true victims of gun violence, the ones that really never get the story heard, are often ignored because they're in small like altercations, right? So in terms of the neg, maybe you can argue that this bill is overkill, but I really just don't see how you'd get away with that because of how strong the AF is. And hopefully, you do decide to go on the AF as well, because I genuinely do firmly believe that it is for the best interest of the country. Um, so yeah, sorry, that was a bit heavy, but do you guys have any questions before we move on? Nope. Okay, let's keep going. All right, we're transitioning into something a little bit more lighthearted now. Um, a bill to allow voting by phone in all federal elections. We had a bill just like this. I think it was literally word for word this from Sunvite. Um, this is a pretty simple debate from what I've seen. Really, the AF just has to argue a simple like point. The burden of the AF is to prove that mobile voting is actually for the better because more people are able to vote. Um, Believe it or not, a large portion of people who don't vote are because they don't have the time to, they lack access to polls, or they just don't feel like they have the need to actually vote, right? And of course, this bill doesn't do anything to affect the last part because, I mean, you can't make someone care more about the election by voting from by their phone, unless you have a card for that, in which case, so be it. But really, all this is targeting is people who want to vote but can't because they don't have the resources to or they don't have the time to. Um, and so that's the entire burden of the app. We get more voter turnout. We see more people involved in elections, and in some very decisive like races, especially for the federal election in swing states, voting by phone could be the difference between a blue state or a red state. You know, um, for example, when I gave a speech for this bill, I came across the fact that during one federal election, I believe it was in I want to say 2016, mail-in ballots, right, which were created to solve the problems that this bill is directly addressing often had about a 1% failure rate because ballots weren't submitted by the time that, the mail-in ballot like reception date closed because of postal delays, right? That was one of the most cited reasons. So basically, about 400,000 people could not have their vote counted because the postal service just didn't get it into the office in time, which is just not fair. And 400,000 votes is no small number. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, when elections are cast by like 60 million people, that's different. But in terms of individual states, that could really be the difference between a red state and a blue state, which could determine an entire election, right? That's where we are in terms of our federal elections. Everything is so cutthroat, so like neck and neck. This bill could literally be the difference, right? But that's what the AF has to prove. The NEG has a very simple case here. To be completely truthful, mobile voting is very, very risky because it doesn't have very strong and very robust security systems. Um, Mobile voting systems struggle to counteract hackers and other programs that try to manipulate votes. And there have been countless examples of mobile voting failing because of hackers able to access those ballots and modify them before they're received by the office, which is a big problem because that means that the net can turn the AF here. If the AF argues that mobile voting can be the difference between like a Democratic or Republican president be elected, the net can now argue like, great, so now those ballots are all controlled by a hacker, which means that like one hacker group can literally determine the entire election based off the AF logic, right? Of course, that's a little bit extreme, but it's not like logically wrong if the AF chooses to take that stance. So the neg has a good turn. Um, so yeah, core neg is cybersecurity issues because these systems have not worked in the past. Core AF is that you increase accessibility, and that's really good for elections, especially Section 2B here, because it's saying that this bill is directly targeting people who like cannot find access to polls, which would be voters with disabilities, military and overseas voters, voters on tribal lands, hospitalized voters, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so yeah, this one is a lot more simple. Do you guys have any questions? Next one. This one is a little bit odd. I've never actually seen a debate like this before, which makes it all the more interesting. But a bill to establish a minimum wage for working incarcerated individuals to reform prison labor. Let's start from the top and let's understand that this bill is directly targeting private prisons, right? Which are different from public prisons, which are managed by the state. If you didn't already know, there are several companies that literally profit off of putting people in jail. Their entire business is they build correctional facilities, they house inmates because the government doesn't have enough facilities to house them. And so long as they follow some strict security protocols, they're all good. Um, of course, that means that those private facilities are not held to the same regulatory standard as public ones. That's just how the nature of public versus private works. So in private prisons, there is a lot more abuse. There's a lot more lack of access to healthcare services for inmates. There's all these different things. And so, in effect, private prisons often are kind of like a worse place to be in than a public prison, which is what this bill is directly talking about. Um, this bill is trying to rectify that difference by increasing the wage of workers in private prisons to $7.25 an hour. Um, Really, all this is trying to do is provide better opportunities for workers in private prisons so that they're kind of more up to par with public ones. Not to say that they have a lot of opportunity, but it provides them with some, higher baseline that allows them to make more money for their work. And I mean, you can take that with a bunch of different impacts. I can't think of any ultimately strong ones on the top of my head, but of course, like this gives prisoners once they get out of prison, this gives them a higher chance of, seeking reform because like if you're working for like a 10-year sentence and you're stuck in prison and you're doing your job and you're getting paid such a little amount of money, by the time you get out, you're not going to have enough money to probably like restart your life, right? And so I think the AF here can take a very human impact and be like, look, not every prisoner is a bad person at heart, right? I'm not talking about murderers. I'm not talking about like anyone who committed a serious crime. But like a lot of people who do find themselves in here could have been convicted of like financial crimes where they took advantage of a system, right? Did they do a bad thing? Yes, and they scammed people out of a lot of money. But that kind of criminal can definitely be reformed compared to someone who is like a murderer, right? Especially surrounding the circumstances of that financial situation. If the guy committed that financial like fraud or that financial crime because of being impoverished or whatever, he might not deserve to have the same 40-year sentence that like a serial killer deserves, right? Or like the death penalty. Not to say that, this bill affects the death penalty, but the core idea here is that like, okay, for any prisoner that will get out of their, will get out of prison in a reasonably short amount of time. This bill provides them with a higher baseline to be able to re-enter and reintegrate with society, which provides them with a better basis to reestablish their life, right? Which is huge because so many criminals do actually reform. They do rehabilitate and they start contributing to society and they start doing all these great things. But that often gets overshadowed by the fact that if we don't give them the tools to actually build themselves up again, they're going to be shut out by society. They're going to be labeled as a criminal, a convict. And that often forces them to recidivism. So the AF, again, can take a very human approach here by arguing what I just said. The neg, probably you could offer that like private prisons actually can't afford this. There are so many people in private prisons, and private prisons profit margins aren't that high. So they might not be able to afford this bill. And what does that look like? Well, that means that they have to accept less inmates, which means that the backlog in America's justice system is going to get worse and worse. You're not going to have a place to put all these criminals. You're not going to be able to provide them with the actual like a place to be in a correctional facility. And that poses serious questions for the justice system because if someone gets convicted for a crime and we have nowhere to send them, what do? Right? So AF argues the human side of things, Neg argues the feasibility side of things. And in terms of weighing, the AF needs to prove that not only do private prisons are able to afford this, but that inmates will genuinely benefit from this bill and that the benefits outweigh the risks or like the harms, right? The neg needs to argue that in no world is this actually realistically feasible for a private prison company, and that once they like have to shut down or scale down, they're not going to be able to handle the same capacity, or they're not going to be able to deal with like any further prisoners, or they're going to have to let some prisoners go after some talks with the government. Like it really is all up in the air. The other thing that private prisons can do is they can potentially stop allowing inmates to work because of the fact that they can't afford it, right? Which also poses its own questions. So that's really what I think the essence of this debate is. Like the other bills, I mean, I think that the AF is stronger because it can really drive that impact home with the human side of things. But the neg also has a good case, and if you frame the neg like well enough, you'll have no problem making a solid speech there. So, do you guys have any questions? If not, we'll just move on. You guys don't seem to have any questions for a lot of these, so I'm just going to keep skipping down. And if you guys do have questions, I'll see them in the chat. So, um, no worries. Okay, next one. This is regarding Nigeria. This is a resolution to prioritize Nigerian sovereignty to prevent coercive intervention and strategic overreach. This is directly talking about the strikes that the US committed on Nigeria just a few weeks ago, under the command of President Trump, when he decided to strike certain groups because, according to his sources, there is a massacre of Christians in Nigeria, although claims surrounding that have been dubious. So do take that with a grain of salt and do conduct your own research, right? See what you can find. Um, yes, so the United States struck Nigeria, right? And then the issue kind of died down. We haven't seen much developments in Nigeria since. We haven't seen any like change in U.S. policy regarding Nigeria. It was kind of like a one and done move. And so the question here is, how does this realistically affect Nigerian sovereignty, right? Does this bill have much effect on Nigerian sovereignty? Does this bill actually matter with U.S. interests? Because are we going to strike Nigeria again, right? Really, I guess the resolution is just preventing us from striking again, but everything is so inconclusive here. I'd be surprised if this gets debated, but if it does, it's so difficult for either side to win because there's very little basis for either side to win on. Um, let's see, we've got a question in the chat. All right, so it says heard China also to partake in some in Nigeria. So if the U.S. gets in Nigeria, China gets in more, and isn't that worse than the U.S. saying? Okay, so if you're gonna take like the Chinese approach, that's not uncommon for a lot of the countries that we talk about because, global politics right now is kind of just like a power play between the Chinese Communist Party and the United States government. Um, I do think that you could definitely talk about China here. I just don't know how important it is because, first off, really all this is saying that like we're not going to strike Nigeria, which is different because this is not saying that we have to now leave Nigeria entirely. Like, this is not saying that our NGOs have to stop operating there. It's not saying that we can no longer partner with Nigeria. It's just saying that, like, we can't do anything that compromises autonomy. And that's what the bill says, right? We can't do something that could be perceived as a violation of Nigeria's sovereignty or rights to self-rule. Um, and yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, that really only affects the strikes that we had because that was a kind of a direct breach of their sovereignty. We just struck them. Um, but yeah, I don't. The only question regarding China is I just don't know how it would affect the Chinese situation because again, this is only just saying we can't strike Nigeria, not saying that we can't work with them. Um, so unfortunately, I don't have much stuff to talk about with this one. It's really obscure on both sides. Um, I really don't know how either side would win this because you'd have to talk about our US strikes, but reports on those US strikes are also not that clear. So, not much to go off for either side. Of course, the AF can argue that like by respecting any country's sovereignty, we're allowing more stability and we're allowing for more conflict resolution because US involvement has historically been bad. And on the neg, it could be like, well, look at how our strikes were, right? Like according to X, Y, and Z, violence in Nigeria has decreased because of a result of our strikes and something. Or like US autonomy helps resolve problems that Nigeria themselves cannot fix. Maybe because of like a fractured government or because of a lack of jurisdiction, whatever, right? But aside from those two main arguments, I really don't know where the neg could go or the AF. So yeah, this one was the quick one. If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to talk about them. But if not, I guess we'll just keep moving. All right. The Appearance Restoration Act. This one is interesting. I think that it has its merits, but it's also going to be a little bit of a confusing debate. Um, all this is saying is any treatment that helps a person return their appearance to their pre disease state or pre-medically affected state is now covered by federal insurance programs and private insurance, right? Key thing to know here. Do not take restorative treatments to mean plastic surgery. This is not saying that insurers have to cover surgeries done to enhance one's appearance for the sake of it, right? That does not include certain surgeries regarding, like certain appearances of body parts, such as like a nose or other things. Um, it doesn't have anything to do with that. Really, all this is saying is that, like, especially in section two, that's what needs to be focused on here. Any treatment that is medically necessary to restore normal appearance or function of something um, is now covered by this bill, right? So let's say if someone was a victim of like a gunshot wound, right? Gunshot wounds can leave some serious, serious marks on your body, right? And if that's in a very visible place, people might not want that to be completely evident. So, under this legislation, the person who was the victim of that issue will now be able to receive a treatment that can help that wound look healed and look more like normal skin. And that will be covered by insurance, right? Which allows them to afford it, which I think is very interesting. So, AF here. AF definitely has to go all in on like body dysmorphia, discrimination, um, or like things like that, like mental health. And the reason I say that is there are a lot of diseases or illnesses that affect millions of people that affect how they look, right? And those can be remedied, but the procedures are really, really expensive, right? This bill helps them cover that cost. So they'll be able to afford that and that they won't have to deal with the consequences of their, physical illness. So what does that look like in terms of like an impact on the individual person? Well, biggest thing on the app that I think you could impact to is that if someone is insecure about like some mark on their body or some issue regarding a function of an organ in their body, they're going to have that insecurity, which can in turn affect their mental health and can in turn, create body dysmorphia and can, reduce all these different types of like mental outcomes. I think the key to the app here is by making this a human impact, by arguing that some of these restorative treatments are not like a lot of them are not done for the sake of it, like plastic surgeries are. They're done for the sake of helping someone overcome their insecurities, which helps them with their mental health situation, which helps them with, combating all sorts of different things. And you can impact that to anything regarding mental health. And I think that's a really good speech because it takes an issue that may seem completely like arbitrary and odd to even talk about and make it really human because believe it or not, this actually is an issue that affects a lot of people. In terms of the neg, I think the neg will actually slip up here. Realistically, in a debate, they might have a hard time trying to differentiate between like restorative treatments that are medically necessary versus treatments that are done to just improve the appearance of an already functioning or already cosmetically okay thing. Um, I personally don't see how well the neg can counter that mental health point that we discussed. But either way, I mean, like, I just think that if you really, really go all in on the mental health aspect and talk about how important that is, um, there's very little that I can do to counter that, you know? Maybe the neg can mitigate by saying these procedures are not actually that needed, or that these procedures are very, very rare, but or that there could be like, some sort of fraud with it. I don't even know. Or that the funding in the bill is not enough, right? It really is unclear what the neg could clearly try to argue and win with. So for that, I don't really have much, but I do think that the AF here is very strong. If you reframe the debate around like, oh, this is just us covering more things, to being like, no, this is us really targeting an issue that is affecting people mentally, and this helps them with so many different outcomes, right? Like all sorts of different things that you can go with mental health. I mean, there are like 100 different impacts you can go with mental health. You can go with like um, depression risk. You can talk about like inability to focus or like, concentrate at work. You can talk about increased social media usage. You can talk about like increased isolation. You can talk about, increased spending habits. You can talk about worse health outcomes, everything, right? It, I just personally think you should just pick whatever you think is the strongest and what matters to you the most there and go all in on that. So yeah, do you guys have any questions on this? If not, we'll just keep going. Okay, awesome. All right. A bill to establish teacher maximums. I believe this is the second to last prelim bill. Yes. Okay. So, this is kind of ill-timed in my opinion. Um, this is kind of hard to win on the ask because of the circumstances that we're in. Let me explain. So, of course, this bill doesn't need much contextualization aside from the fact that the country is still reeling from this massive t-shirt shortage that we had, and we're still in, technically, where, schools don't have enough teachers. That's it. The people are not getting education majors, they're not willing to teach for a myriad of reasons. Um, but that's really affecting student outcomes, right? So this bill has two very clean sides to it, and I think it's actually a pretty solid debate. The AF, all you have to argue here is that students receiving students in smaller groups with a teacher, right? With considering like no more than 25 students in a given class period receive better educational outcomes, right? Um, you can definitely talk about how like in the smaller groups, students receive higher test scores because they get like more one-on-one time with their teachers, or the teachers can, grade their quality more or grade their content more personalized, provide more personalized feedback because the teacher doesn't have like a million people to tend to. And on the flip side of that, you can also talk about how the teacher is less burdened because if you're restricting it to 90 students, I mean, as far as I know, even the teachers in my school receive more than 90 students all the time. Like one of my history teacher, just for AP US history, has like 200 students that he has to deal with, which is crazy, right? And so he doesn't have the time to go through and effectively grade everything. He doesn't have the time to individually, truly care about each and every student. And that poses problems for the student, and that poses problems for the teacher's own well-being. So this bill kind of tries to fix that problem by restricting the number of students so that the student and the teacher receives better outcomes. The neg here is basically contradicting everything that I just said. The neg is going to say that this is not feasible because the reason why teachers are overburdened is because we don't have enough teachers. If we had enough teachers to fit this maximum, it would already be in place because we don't want to purposefully overburden our teachers. It's just that it's not feasible, right? So if you pass this legislation, what's going to happen? Well, let's say that like one teacher in a made up school in Atlanta, right, where Emory is, has like 120 students, right? And they're the only teacher in that school that can teach that subject, right? Now the school is required to hire another teacher to take over the other 30 students, or if they wanted to split it down the line to be 60 students each, right? But they can't find another teacher. Now what, right? So now look at section two. What's the punishment? Well, if you can't find a replacement teacher to take over the remaining students, you now just lose all your federal funding. It's pretty harsh, right? So a lot of schools that will not be able to find a teacher to take up their students are going to struggle with this. So they're left with an ultimatum. Either they continue to overburden their teachers, but at least provide some education to their students, which in turn results in losing all federal funding, or they keep their federal funding and have to just kick like 30 students out of their class because they physically cannot take them in if they want to keep their funding, right? It's the bill frames this very like non-black and white issue as a black and white issue. And that poses significant risks for so many different schools. So again, to just summarize, on the AF here, you argue that students will receive better educational outcomes by receiving, smaller class sizes. Teachers will be less overburdened, right? And the AF can even make a turn to the neck here and say, like, well, if we prevent the overburdening of teachers with this legislation, more people will be incentivized to become teachers, which in the long term will help with the teacher shortage, right? Because a large reason as to why people don't become teachers is because they're worried about being overburdened. The neg can argue that this bill is really just an ultimatum that schools cannot answer, right? Either world is bad. Either the school continues to overburden their teacher, continues to lose their federal funding with this bill, but at least each student still gets education, or teachers are not overburdened, the school receives federal funding, but students are locked out of education systems, right? Neither world is good. So, what's the solution here? That's what the neck has to argue, right? There is no solution. This is just unfeasible with the situation and the current landscape of like teaching, and this is bound to create so many more problems than it actually tries to solve. Which I think makes this a really, really intricate and interesting debate. So, do you guys have any question? Okay, let's keep going. All right, I believe this is the last prelim bill. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. We do have a last question on the last bill. Could you explain how this ties to federal funding? Yeah. So just look at section 2 here. Really, all it's saying is that any federally funded school or school district that violates this legislation shall lose said funding until such time as compliance is reached. So if the school does not follow the 90 students per teacher cap, they're going to lose federal funding. That's bad, right? Because the neg can argue if the school cannot find another teacher to help take some of those students off and reduce their teacher to student ratio to lower than 1 to 90, there's going to be an issue where the school physically cannot follow this legislation because they cannot find other teaching staff, and they'll just lose their federal funding, right? On the flip side, the school can be like, no, you know what? We want to prioritize our students' outcomes, so we'll continue to give them education and we'll keep the status quo, right? Every student gets an education, maybe not the best quality one, but they continue to receive an education. But the teachers continue to be overburdened. And because of that, because they're exceeding that 1 to 90 limit, the school will lose federal funding, which has so many terrible ramifications for the school, right? So it's basically an ultimatum that the school cannot meet no matter what they do. That's what the NEC has to argue. And that's how that ties into federal funding. So I hopefully that kind of cleared things up a little bit more. Um, yeah, of course. There we go. All right. Now on to the next one. The Jones Act. Okay, so this was debated at Blue Key, I want to say. Um, if I can remember correctly. This is really just trying to say that we're going to allow foreign ships and foreign companies staffed by foreigners to transport cargo domestically. Um, that was what the Jones Act did. It did a whole lot of stuff regarding like maritime shipping and whatnot, which is huge in like today's economy. I mean, so many of your goods get shipped by boat, of course. Like if you got a car from Europe, that was sent over here by ship. Um, but in fact, a lot of the shipping actually does happen between American ports. So like a lot of shipping, especially for companies, not for individual people, like if you order something from Amazon, but a lot of stuff for companies, like bulk items, get shipped by boat. So, either by train, by truck, or by sea. If you find another T word for sea, use that. Uh, but train, truck, or by sea. Those are the three main methods of transporting items. So if you wanted to ship something from like New York, which is one of the largest ports in the country, to Miami, which is near where I am, those are two domestic ports. So underneath the Jones Act, the ship that's executing that route must be owned by an American company, must be built by an American shipyard, and must be crewed by Americans, right? The entire idea behind that was that we want to increase and like protect our shipbuilding industry and whatnot. The problem is that this makes things very expensive for shipping companies, right? And in turn makes things expensive when you're shipping goods, which, price gets passed down to businesses and consumers that are actually purchasing these items. So by repealing this legislation, the AF seeks to do one thing primarily, which is reduce costs, right, for both consumers and for businesses. And you do that because foreign companies and foreign, you know, ships are more abundant, obviously, but also they're able to, some of the like the largest shipping companies in the world, like Maersk and MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Company. Um, they've got these huge fleets that are more than capable of handling this kind of traffic for a much cheaper price because they've already optimized all of their systems, right? Um, whereas American companies might struggle to do the same. So AF wants to reduce costs, and that's good for all the reasons we don't have to really talk about. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? But the NEG argues that no, the Jones Act is super, super critical to keeping our shipbuilding industry and naval industry alive, right? And you can definitely argue that, but I still think the AF wins because, in all fairness, the maritime industry in America is slowly, slowly dying. And you've only got a handful of shipyards that are actually still fully active in America compared to around the world. Like compared to Hyundai's, which if you didn't know, Hyundai Heavy Industries, which is related to the Hyundai car company, they actually build huge vessels, such as car carriers. They're one of the biggest shipbuilders in the world, and they're based in Korea. Korea is a huge, huge shipbuilder, one of the only left in the world. But yeah, they kind of dominate the world market right now. So, I mean, yeah, AF argues that costs go down with this bill. Neg can argue, actually, you could probably argue on the neg that with this bill, with the Jones Act and the cabotage provision, you're able to re-incentivize that growth into American shipbuilding, which aligns with the Trump administration policies, such as, all the tariffs that we've tried to implement, everything that we've tried to do to protect American industry is definitely like aided by this. So you can argue on the neg keeping the cabotage provision now is super important because if you want to bolster American industry as per the Trump administration's goals, you're able to do so with this legislation by protecting American shipbuilders, right? And so this gives us the path to help American shipbuilders, basically come back from the dead, rise from the ashes, and start building ships again, right? Like make America's shipping great again. I don't know. Make America ship again. I don't know. Whatever. Point is, that's what the neg has to argue, and the AF just has to argue, well, costs actually outweigh that because it makes more sense economically for costs for shipping to go down than it is for American industry to be bolstered by this legislation, right? So, in summary, this bill is really just an economic debate more than it is like any kind of maritime debate. I definitely suggest researching the economics of shipping and how these things actually like play out. But yeah, I mean, do you guys have any questions, or we can keep going? Okay, I guess we'll keep going. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first semi bill. Oh, wait, no, sorry. Jones Act was the first semi bill. Okay. So gerrymandering is the second semi bill. Nice. Okay. This is a long bill. Wow. A bill to establish independent redistricting commission to abolish gerrymandering. Oh, this is a doozy. I out of all the Sems bills that I've seen, I honestly don't know which ones we debated because they're all just so complex and there's not really a very like clear, I mean, like this is very, very hard. So I'll do my best to explain. I'm not going to hit all the bases here of these bills because of how layered their impacts really are. But I'll still try, of course. So, if you haven't been up to date on the news, there's been this whole issue surrounding gerrymandering and how it's been like revived in American politics, especially as a result of the Trump administration. Although a lot of it has happened under the Biden administration as well. Um, Most notably, there were two major fights going on. There was one in California, which Governor Gavin Newsom actually successfully blocked with support of Democrats in the state legislature that sought to redistrict a large portion of California to help certain political parties achieve their goals. And the one that actually did pass was in Texas. Texas state legislators actually passed a bill, I believe, that allowed them to redistrict a large part of their congressional like elector maps to favor one political party over another. And that's obviously terrible, right? If you're not familiar with gerrymandering, that's what that is. Gerrymandering is just how politicians modify electoral maps so that like certain political parties receive more like votes, and so they're able to win elections more easily. Um, so yes, definitely research the California issue, research the Texas issue, because those are the most recent ones. Um, but yeah, all this bill is basically saying is that it's no longer up to the states to draw their own party lines, right? Because of course that is acting in their own self-interest, and that's not actually how you have a free and fair election. Instead, we're going to establish this our own commission that is required to redraw these district lines every 12 years. Um, this is it's a little bit iffy as to what this means though, because like it says this independent redistricting commission will be created by the state. Um, I believe when it says state here, it doesn't mean like state as in like the national state, as in like the United States government. I think it means like each of the 50 states, as it says here. So really, this is trying to abolish the problem of state legislatures choosing their own districts. Instead, it gives us to this new independent board that every 12 years comes together to establish new party lines that the electoral system of the state legislature can be based on, or for the federal government as well. Um, this is a good idea, ideologically, right? Effectively, kind of questionable, though. Yes, there is a clause in Section 3 here that's saying that the FEC will intervene if it's observed that there are any discrepancies in any of the terms above. Um, it's trying to help, like, the issue of gerrymandering, but of course, with politics, there is always some form of lobbying, right? And I think that's what's going to take place here. If you have this own independent redistricting commission, there's a good chance that both parties are going to definitely hop on that and try to influence it in whatever way that they can, right? And that's not good because then that kind of undoes all the purpose of the bill. Of course, the FEC here is trying to intervene, but it's unsure if they're actually going to be able to do much. Um, of course, there is guidelines to how these committees will be formed here, but again, still unclear how this is going to actually play out, right? Um, so AF here has to just argue that this is actually going to like I think AF and NEG here have to actually debate surrounding the feasibility and like realistic impacts of this because the AF can go on a tangent about like all the benefits of abolishing gerrymandering, but none of that actually matters if the NEG can easily win by saying, well, if both parties are just going to lobby here, what's the actual point, right? None of those impacts on the app actually come to fruition. And maybe the Ned can actually argue that this is for the worse. I'm not sure how you'd be able to do that off the top of my mind, but there's probably a way here. Um, so yeah, I mean, the AF definitely has to argue that this will work, and they have to prove that one way or another. The NEC has to disprove that and also mention that this legislation isn't not only is it not going to work, but it actually has some net harms. And I think you'd be able to find those net harms if you really, really closely examine Section 2, because there are so many different like stipulations that need to be met for these committees. It's unlikely that all of them will be able to be easily met, or there'll be loopholes, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the last semis bill. Um, this is a very, very like this is like the bill to cap the price of pharmaceutical drugs, but on steroids. The Cure Farmer Act. Really, all this is doing is a bunch of different stuff, right? If you had to condense it into one sentence, all the Cure Farmer Act wants to do is just increase accessibility to drugs for all Americans, right? Which is a very noble and very good idea, right? Like we should be supporting that. Um, but it does so in so many different ways, and that makes the debate kind of hard to follow, in my opinion. It's going to be very, it's going to be very hard to figure out where this debate is going to go, only because it's so broad. There's so many things to talk about. There's so many things to weigh, to compare, right? And so I think the winning strategy here is to definitely simplify, right? Go all in on the approach of how do we simplify this debate, right? Like, how do we bring everything back to the basics of increasing accessibility, no matter how much lingo is thrown around, no matter how complicated the debate gets, right? Keep in mind, your judges might get lost pretty easily with this bill just because of how much stuff there is in it. I mean, like, there is essential medications over here, there's drug patent exclusivity periods, which is a whole other thing that's usually its own bill. You've got drug development, you've got FDA approval, like stipulations. You've got stipulations regarding reinvestment. You've got price caps that rival other countries. You've got negotiations going on, like all this different stuff. And I mean, you've got penalties that are absolutely astronomically high, $100 million per violation. Like, it is so, so much stuff to talk about. And I really think you can go af or neg here. I'm not going to tell you what to do because there's so much stuff to talk about on both sides. Just go in on bringing this debate back to its core. Talk about what this bill really means, right? What do these price caps really look like in practice, both on the av and on the neg? And that's all you have to go from there. That's all I have for this bill. There's so much stuff. It's really hard to predict where this bill is going to go. So, I mean, honestly, hats off to you guys for trying semis. I really do wish the best, but all three of these bills are pretty complicated. I think the Jones Act is actually the simplest one out of all of them somehow. Um, so yeah, do you guys have any questions? I think you might because I mean this is just so much stuff. All right, let's keep going. All right, welcome to finals. We've got three bills left. Thank you guys so much for sticking through it for the past hour. We're nearly there. Okay. The Sudan Aid for Emergency Relief Act. Um, all right. This is, I don't know if you guys have um worked with the legislation we had on Myanmar in the past. Um, but this is kind of similar. It's just for Sudan, right? Not the situations are not similar whatsoever, but the framing of the bill is. I'd also like to point out that I just saw that for some reason the World Food Program's acronym is now WTF, which I thought was funny. Um, we'll ignore that. Okay, so this bill is okay. Contextualization. If you don't already know, there's a civil war going on in Sudan right now. Another one, yes, there was one that originally resulted in the split of Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan, and there's another civil war now in Sudan. Um, and it's one of the bloodiest battles we've seen in decades. I mean, bloody. There have been reports that you can now see blood on the streets of Sudan from space, which is how bad it is, right? It's an absolutely ravaged and terrible situation. And so that's where this bill tries to come in, right? We're allocating $350 million in humanitarian aid to mitigate the effects of violence. We'll send 10,000 troops for peacekeeping, and they'll be there for a year. right? And the troops will only be there for self-defense or to protect the aid. They're not going to be there for offensive operations. I think that this debate needs to be centered around risk and reward. Is this a good idea? Yes. Right? Like, is it good to help people who are struggling and suffering and dying? Yes. Absolutely, hands down. You cannot argue against that on the neg, reasonably. So instead, the neg has to definitely go on like, is the risk to our troops and to our presence in the region destabilizing the conflict even further actually worth us even trying to get aid in there in the first place, right? So I think on both sides, you need to research the effects of US troops in Sudan and what that's going to look like for Sudan. Is it going to have stabilizing effects? Are the groups going to engage with our troops, right? Do the risks of this conflict, of getting engaged in this conflict, actually outweigh or not outweigh the benefits we could see by helping the millions in Sudan who are suffering from the violence, right? That's what this debate is at its core. Um, I personally think that the AF can win on an argument and impact of we need to be there for the Sudanese people because right now they're not capable of being there for themselves, right? Like the situation has evolved so badly that it is basically our duty to be there for them and to support them and to give them the aid that they need. We're not getting directly involved in the crisis. We're not trying to create more bloodshed. We're just there to help people who are going through one of the most traumatizing and dehumanizing experiences you could possibly ever experience, right? So, I think you can make a very strong speech here on the AF and win the debate if you manage to prove that this will work. That if you'll manage to prove that the benefits we'll see will outweigh the risks, right? And the neg is just the flip side of that. The neg has to argue that sending our troops there is bad because we're going to destabilize the region. We're going to lose American troops. The aid will get stolen, all sorts of different things. So, this is a very, very tense situation, but it's a fairly simple debate at its true core. So, do you guys have any questions, or can we keep going? Okay, let's keep going. All right, a bill to remove arms from Egypt. This is super simple. All this bill is doing, obviously, is just preventing us from selling weapons or working militarily with Egypt. That's honestly, I don't really know why we would do this. I don't exactly know what Egypt is doing with their military. So I would definitely say start with researching there. There's nothing on the top of my mind that really can be used to talk about this. The only mention of Egypt's military that I can remember off the top of my mind is right now Egypt is going through a very, very difficult time. Like the country is not doing too hot because they're receiving so many refugees from Sudan. They're receiving so many refugees from Israel and Gaza. And they're having their own crises inside of itself. So it's not doing too well. And as a result, the Egyptian government has gotten a little bit more oppressive. And so that's what Section 3 here is talking about. Um, contingent on human rights conditions improving in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula based on US audits, right? So even though the bill doesn't exactly say it, I think the core idea of the bill is to restrict how much the Egyptian government can do in terms of human rights violations by taking away their weapons. Um, does this mean that the weapons that they currently have that we sold to them are now taken back? Obviously not. But it's an attempt to try to like nudge them towards the right direction. Um, Definitely explore how how their military is being used in the status quo, what it's being used for, et cetera, and go from there. Um, I don't think it's going to be I think it should also be a question of is this really going to matter to Egypt, right? Because there is a non-zero chance that Egypt will kind of just receive their weapons from another source. This is very similar to the Saudi Arabia debate regarding Yemen. It is very possible that China will now just start supplying Egypt weapons and they won't improve their human rights conditions, right? Because they'll still have their weapons. and we lose our leverage. So that's really what the core of the debate is. I mean, Af and I can go either way. Do you guys have any questions? Not, I guess we'll jump to the last bill. All right, fantastic. Okay, this one's a doozy. This one I think is actually the best debate in finals, but it is tough. Um, the reason I say that is because I don't think the neg can genuinely win all too easily. I don't think the AF can win all too easily. I firmly agree with the AF. That is my core belief, right? I think that like use it, or sorry, not use it with the AF, with the neg. I got that backwards. Forgive me. I firmly believe with the agree with the neg. I think using AI in immigration courts with the status quo is a pretty bad idea because of A, how AI functions, B, how the government's functioning, and C, what the actual AI of implementation looks like. Let's start with number one, or A, how AI actually works. AI historically has been pretty discriminatory against minorities. They've been a racist, right? There's been all sorts of different studies conducted on AI's capabilities and have consistently found that artificial intelligence discriminates against a non-white people, be it if you're a boy or a girl, right? The problem in the context of this bill is that the vast majority of people in immigration courts are non-white, especially with the situation that's going on with ICE and everything with the Trump administration right now. So if we're talking about like AI sorting cases right here, it is not going to make fair judgments. That's what the neg is going to argue, right? Like identifying low risk applicants would be literally anyone that isn't a minority, right? So like anyone that is white would be considered a low risk applicant because the AI is, trained on that information. Um, the rest of the information is okay. Like the rest of the usage of AI is okay. Um, the only thing is in terms of sorting cases as well, right? Like the other thing, the Trump administration has recently halted refugee and asylum status and visa processing. That's another big one. But I'll get to that in a moment. They've halted refugees almost entirely, except if you're like a white person from South Africa because of that whole like massacre that was supposedly going on in South Africa. But it's very, very hard to claim refugee status or asylum status in the United States now. And so the core problem here is how is the AI going to actually sort these cases? Is it going to be done off of like race? Is it going to be done off of um, genuine concern for like the migrant's life? We don't know. And that's in itself a big risk, right? Because the AI system can auto reject someone's asylum case just because it's trained on information that makes it discriminate against minorities, right? That's bad because then someone who might be fleeing violence in their home country is now forced to be deported or sent back to their country because of this AI system, right? Even though they had a perfectly justifiable case. That's the big problem here that I have with this bill. Um, I think that making these rulings is like the same thing as the sorting cases. It's bad, right? It's a bad idea. The rest of it is fine. Like the rest of identifying low risk applicants, translating documents is all great, right? I think that's okay because it helps like reduce, except for the identify low risk applicants, sorry, translating, scheduling, sending notices, and etc. are all good because it reduces burden on the court system, right? And it saves time. But the biggest problem is that you're not going to be able to give people the true justice that they need with their immigration case if you make an AI system sort their case, identify them, and make a ruling on their supposedly low risk cases, right? Of course, there's the oversight with this bill, but I don't think that's enough to safely say, you know what, this is completely foolproof. Um, and of course, like the AI system being provided with any access to any data necessary as attained by the Government Accountability Office, right? So I firmly believe that the AF here has to prove that this is a net benefit because the vast majority of immigration cases can be handled quickly but they're not because of the backlog, right? And that has ramifications for the immigrants themselves. The neg can easily counteract that by saying, well, the AI that you're using is going to discriminate. It's going to make false judgments. It's not going to give people the justice that they need. And that's bad, right? Because it's not giving immigrants the chance that they deserve at a free life, right? I think it just comes down to weighing. And it really is a case of like, is it worth it to try and even train the AI to reduce the backlog? Or is the AI just so far gone that like there is no hope for it, right? So it's just between those two. But again, it all boils down to weighing. I think both sides can win here. Really, really go in on the human impact on both sides, though. On the F, you can argue that like this is so good because now people are not spending 5 years in detention or being chased down by like ICE or immigration systems because of, problems with their case. It's just handled like that. And then they'll get their decision. They can either stay in the United States or be sent back, but that's okay because we put our trust in the AI and we're holding it accountable. That's the human side of it. For the neg, the human side is just the flip side, right? AI is so bad at its job that it's going to start sending these people that you advocate for back to prison, back to being deported to their home country, back to violence. They'll never have their court heard before a judge, and they're never going to have a shot at a free and fair life because of the system that we're implementing and forcing upon them, right? I really think that either side can win this debate. It really is just a matter of which side proves to be stronger in the round. But yeah, that is all I have for you. So thank you guys so much for hanging out and sticking with me. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I wish you the best of luck with this tournament.